On behalf of the Haskayne School of Business, I would like to welcome you all to today's Enbridge Research in Action session on ESG and risk. I'd like to thank Enbridge for their forward-thinking support of our skill development and innovation programs, such as today's event, which will facilitate strategic conversations. My name is Terry Ross, and I'm the Director of the Center for Corporate Sustainability at the Haskayne School of Business. Our center is focused on leading skill development in students, as well as leading conversations with stakeholders and thought leaders about strategic sustainability topics. Today, we're focusing in on risks and what lessons we can learn from the experiences and strategic vision of TransAlta. We want to know, what is risk? How can ESG strategy affect risk? And what are the risks of not adapting to trends like ESG? In a complex world fraught with uncertainty, understanding and mitigating risk is more important than it's ever been. As your host today, I'd like to welcome you, literally, to the territory of Treaty 7 and the acknowledgement that this event is hosted on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis region of Alberta, Region 3. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the MC for today's ceremonies, Dr. Yrjo Koskinen, the Associate Dean of Research and Business Impact, and the BMO Professor of Sustainable Finance at the Haskayne School of Business. Yrjo has an extremely long and accomplished resume, but some highlights include being the president of the Northern Finance Association. He serves on the advisory board for the Institute for Sustainable Finance and is on the steering committee for the Canadian Sustainable Financing Network. It is now my pleasure to welcome Yrjo Koskinen to be the Master of Ceremonies, and welcome our panelists. Over to you, Yrjo.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for the generous introduction. You're very lucky to have two excellent speakers today. So let me first introduce John Kousinioris. John is the CEO and President of TransAlta. John has held several senior leadership positions prior to becoming a CEO and President at TransAlta, most recently the Chief Operating Officer. And his prior experience has provided him with responsibility for almost every aspect of TransAlta's business. John has also served as the President and Director of TransAlta's Renewables from 2017 to 2021. Prior to joining TransAlta, John was a partner and a co-head of corporate commercial development at Bennett Jones LLP. So John is educated in Western University of Western Ontario, I guess Western University these days, and 2 degrees from York University, MBA, and Bachelor of Laws from Osgoode Hall. Welcome, John. We're very proud and pleased to have you.
Thank you very much.
And we have also Anne Kleffner. Anne is a professor of risk management and a shareholder of Insurance and Risk Management and Haskayne School of Business. Anne joined our school already in 1992, and almost 30 years ago. That's amazing. So she has received a BSBA from Creighton University and a master's and a doctorate from the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania. Anne is a risk management specialist, and her research areas include enterprise risk management, insurance regulation, and corporate social responsibility. And she teaches primarily at the undergraduate program, but also at the corporate director's education program. And Anne is also the past president of the American Risk and Insurance Association. So welcome, Anne, to you as well. We're very, very proud to have both of you here.
Thank you.
Let me go to the first question before I turn to John. So we know that everybody's now talking about ESG, so environmental, social, and governance issues. And I think there has been a huge CJ in the past 5 years, or even the past 2 years, especially in Calgary and Alberta. So where are in terms of recognizing ESG risks as material and important for corporations that they demand attention from C-suite and the board of directors? So Adnan, let's go first to you.
Okay, thanks, Yrjo. And I just want to say how happy I am to be part of this conversation and share the stage with both John and Yrjo today. So I look forward to this conversation. And I want to start by just thinking about how both risk management and CSR have evolved over the last decade. And as both have received greater attention over the last while, I see it that there's been a convergence of sorts, so that now this has brought us to this focus on ESG. So if I start with some just basic risk management principles and think about the fact that risk management is based on this idea of we identify risk, we measure risk, and we manage risk. We can see that companies generally have done a good job with risks that are easy to manage. So risks they have a lot of experience with, risks that are easy to assess. So price risk, physical asset risk, product liability risk. But some risks inherently are way more difficult to manage. And these are long-term risks and intangible risks and risks that are very hard to assess. And this is where I put these ESG risks. So over time, one thing that has brought, again, some attention to this and helped develop some competency in this is social media, and just the fact that corporate behavior is in the spotlight. And this has brought more attention to corporate social responsibility. And what we've seen over the last few years, as you alluded to, is that there's this trend towards using ESG metrics as a way of measuring corporate social responsibility. And this has also helped facilitate bringing ESG into the risk management world, if you will. So companies have for a long time considered ESG risks to some extent in their risk management framework, things like worker safety and pollution and things like that. But what's happened, again, in terms of these metrics is that over time, we've had better ways of measuring it, and companies' enterprise risk management programs have been maturing. And this has also allowed them to take a longer term view and consider some of these intangible risks. And so that has helped bring ESG more into focus. And then the last one, which everybody knows, is that investors are paying more attention to non-financial performance and how non-financial performance affects long-term performance. And particularly companies have a lot of experience about how it affects reputation. So all of these things, I think, have converged to really bring a lot of focus to ESG, and I think also a lot of competency to ESG, and without really being too, I think John's story will sort of help, or TransAlta's story will help highlight that.
Oh, thank you, Anne. So, John, when I was talking to corporate leaders 2 years ago, just before pandemic, I said, don't worry about ESG, flash in the pan, flavor of the month. Nobody's saying that anymore. How come environmental, social, and governance issues have become a hot topic among CEOs and CFOs and others, corporate leaders, and also for board of directors? I think there has been a big change in corporate Calgary within the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Yrjo, thank you, by the way, for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today and to really share some of our own journey as a company at TransAlta. I think, well, let me begin by basically saying that I agree with Anne's comments and just all of the various things that she identified that are becoming top of mind, certainly to business leaders as we try to look forward. I think, when I joined the company in late 2012, I think when we looked at risk management generally, it was done in a relatively reactive way. And I'll use an example. In 2011, we commissioned a $1.5 billion coal plant. And I think if you look today backwards, you'd say, wow, couldn't you see that there was sort of winds of change from an environmental perspective, and that the pressure would come really quickly on decarbonization? And I think the answer to that question is, yeah, you could probably have seen some of those early shoots that were beginning to grow and the trend there. But I don't think people were looking, and I don't think we were unique as a company. We weren't looking long enough at, or far enough down the road at the kinds of things that would occur, which is something that we've changed. So roll forward, at least again, to our company's case, to 2015, and we had a change in government here in Alberta who brought in a climate leadership plan that became almost an existential threat to our company. It would have seen most of our generation being phased out by 2030, including facilities that we were expecting to run to 2060. So it was a major impact on the company. Should we have seen it coming? Maybe, but we didn't. And we didn't see kind of the repercussions of it as much. So roll forward, at least for a company like ours, ESG and really risk management and risk assessment around those three pillars, as I like to call them in our company, is actually core to what we do. So we have gone over the course of the last 6 years, which actually isn't all that long, to kind of being more casual about it, if I can use that term, to being hyper vigilant and deliberate about it, and almost formal in the structures that we have around it. So for our company, it meant the adoption of a clean leadership transition plan. It resulted in us, shutting down a number of our coal plants, converting coal plants to natural gas, which is lower in its emissions. We're shutting down all mining in Canada at the end of this year. We're shutting down mining in the United States by 2025, and have really focused on increasing our renewables growth. And that's all culminated in an emissions reduction of some 61% in our company since about 2014 levels. So a really rapid acceleration of our shift to clean energy, and it's being made even more rapid. Last week, we had a big investor day for our company where we outlined our vision for the next 5 years, and it is an even more accelerated view towards renewables. We're planning by the end of 2020, going from a place where 35% of our EBITDA is tied to green energy or clean energy generation to one where it'll be 70%. With a build out of 2 gigawatts, which is over $3 billion effectively of investment moving into that space. So it is a critical component of what we do. Our core right now is all about not just looking at tangible risks that are within kind of approximate 3-year period, but really spending a lot of time with our board at every strategy session that we do, and really looking to long-term trends, identifying what our convictions are about where the world is headed, and trying to provide an information-rich environment for our internal leadership team, but also for the board, to kind of have that frame in mind as we begin to sort of chart our pathways forward. And just the final point that I would say, Anne mentioned that a lot of investors are increasingly focused on ESG measures. I can tell you that is absolutely the case. We've been, after our investor day, had a lot of one-on-one meetings with investors, research analysts, and time again, we had our investors talk about each of the 3 major pillars. What are we doing about the E? What are we doing about S? What are we doing about G? What are our targets? And what does it mean for a company like ours, including suggestions about, have we thought about accelerating things? Is it a stringent enough target going forward? So the narrative has changed dramatically over a 2-year period, and extends right into the boardroom. So a real change today.
Thank you. So this is what is happening at TransAlta is exciting. And you mentioned existential threats, and you mentioned that ESG risks are more long-term risks. So I'm back to you. So what are the risks of poor environmental, social, and governance performance in general? And how is good ESG performance effective part of risk management strategy? What are we getting out of bringing ESG in the risk management? How does it help us to figure out the long-term risks for a corporation? Like John said, could be existential threat level risk for a corporation.
Mm-hmm. I think one way to think about it is that when companies are not paying attention to ESG, they face significant financial and reputational costs if they get things wrong. And we see some extreme examples of this. And I also want to just sort of make one sort of caveat, which is, when we talk ESG, it's important to recognize that not all of these are important for all companies, and different risks have different levels of priority, materiality, et cetera, right? So without making too many generalizations, I just want to make that statement because I think it's really important. But from a risk management perspective, if you think about the fact that the point of risk management is to manage the risks to your strategy, right? And to consider risk both from a positive and a negative standpoint, right? So there's upside risk, there's downside risk, and there's this idea that this focus on ESG, not only, again, just in the energy transition context, represents potentially an existential threat to lots of companies if they don't react appropriately, but there's also enormous opportunities, right? So from a risk management perspective, again, companies who are looking at this both defensively and strategically, that view of using risk management as a way of achieving your strategy is a way of identifying where you're going to go off course. So that's the first thing. And some of these ESG risks, again, we don't have to go back very far in history to realize a lot of companies were not identifying these risks, or they were downplaying these risks. And in fact, then what would happen is that some of these ESG issues were either the cause or they were related to some very significant losses that companies experienced. Bank of America did a study showing that 24 ESG related events led to a loss of market value of over $500 billion. So we know that those losses can happen, right? So that's one piece. A second piece is that companies who use good ESG performance as let's say a risk management strategy also are far better prepared in terms of managing regulatory risk. And regulatory risk is a very difficult risk to manage. It's long-term, as John said, you can have a change of government, all of a sudden, everything can be on the table, off the table, et cetera. So from an ESG standpoint, that sort of proactive stance towards ESG helps manage regulatory risk and makes it far less likely that a company is going to be caught off guard. I think the discussions around mandatory climate disclosure, for example, are a good example of companies that will be well positioned for that versus those that are not. And then the last one, from a risk standpoint, again, I mean, in terms of access to capital, I do a lot of work in the insurance space. Lloyd's of London is becoming very aggressive about not providing insurance to fossil fuel assets, right? So companies who are not forward-looking, I think, really risk the issue about access to capital, cost of capital, access to insurance, et cetera. So those are three that I think are at least worth considering.
Thank you, Anna. So there are lots of good questions coming up in Q&A. Please submit your questions. We're going to get them shortly. Before that, I'm just going to go to John with at least one more question. So, John, you mentioned that 2015, the new government, and we started to think about, oh my God, this might be existential threats for your company. What are the major issues for a company like TransAlta that you want to manage risk for? Are they environmental, social, or governance, or all of the above?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and Anne touched on a bunch of them. It's actually everything. Initially, I think it began with a focus primarily on just the environmental pillar, less of a focus, I think, on the social and the governance pillar. But in fact, they're all tied together. We do a full integrated report. So every year, our annual report, our MD&A, our management discussion analysis, which covers all the financial disclosure that the company has tied to it a sustainability report by the company. So we don't publish two separate reports. It's all integrated into one. We report on 80 different sustainability measures that touch all of the three pillars of E, S, and G. And it's critical that we do that in terms of just monitoring our own progress on how we proceed. But when I think of our own company, I can give you a sense of some of the challenges and some of the opportunities just in terms of the changes that we're seeing dramatically. There is massive shareholder value, for example, in a shift towards cleaner generation, decarbonization. And just to give you a bit of a sense on that, $1 coming from natural gas-fired generation or coal-fired generation might be worth X, let's say, in your share price. If that same dollar comes from renewables, it might be worth 3 or 4 times X. At sometimes it's actually 6 times X. So the benefit to our shareholders and investors in terms of a migration and shift towards cleaner generation has become an imperative to underpin your shareholder value. It isn't just enough about the cash flows that you're making as a company. The origin and composition of the cash flows are critical to actually determining the financial success of your company. Something else that Anne talked about, access to capital, huge difference in your ability to source capital for clean energy growth versus sourcing capital for what I would call more traditional, higher carbon-based growth. The latter is pretty challenging. The former is unbelievably available to the point where it's actually bidding up the prices of projects because there's so much capital chasing projects that you actually see. So it actually creates a bit of a distortion if you see what I'm saying. On social and governance, if you don't have good governance protocols in your company, people notice it from an investor perspective. And there's more, and Anne made the point earlier in terms of social media, published sources, just information rich in the environment. People see where you rank on board games. Is that a company that I like because their governance approaches are leading in terms of what's considered sort of state of the art in the moment, or do they lag? And if they lag, why do they lag? Is there some unique reason that makes them lag? On social goals, it's critical. I think of our own company and even governance goals. I mean, one of the things that's critical for us is equity, diversity, and inclusion. If your company isn't reflective of the society in which it's operating in, I think you're going to make suboptimal decisions. I think you're not going to be reflective of where society is going. So we have a pretty strong focus right now to have a company where everybody feels comfortable and can bring their whole selves to work. And part of the trick in that is going to be to have a company employee base that is broadly reflective of society. So as a company, because of our sort of industrial past, you can imagine that we have a number of just outstanding employees who've had many decades of service. Our workforce is transitioning a bit, just as our generating fleet is transitioning. So we're going to need to bring in a number of new and most likely younger people into the company. If you're not reflective of the values in the moment, it's going to be challenging for you to actually get that pipeline of talent, because today it's all about talent, that you need to actually drive your business forward, just as another example. And that includes things for us. For example, 23% of our workforce is female. We've targeted getting to 40% by 2030. Hard to do in an industrial, company like ours, but we set the goal, and we set the goal because if we didn't have the goal, we weren't going to actually move. So now it's a top of mind, decision in terms of what it is that we're doing. So I would just say that it is a key component of everything that we do. And it actually, I think, in its most successful form, the targets you set, the awareness around both risk in the near term, the medium term, and the long term, and those ESG targets that you have, they need to be tied to your decision-making and your strategy. If they're not, it's just window dressing, right? But the moment you see that they're actually defining decisions that you make as a company, that I think you're moving into a place where it's actually making an impact. And I'll give you an example of that. We've made a commitment as a company to reduce our emissions by 70% from 2005 levels to 2030. We'll probably actually get there before 2030. In fact, our company, in terms of its emissions reductions, already contributed just by ourselves to 8% of Canada's aggregate Paris commitments, although we haven't as a country. So what we've reduced in emissions have been backfilled by other emissions, that the company has actually generated. We also have a carbon neutrality goal by 2050 that absolutely drives our decision-making. So our ability to actually build new gas-fired generation or, generation that will actually emit is pretty constrained as a consequence of those decisions that we've actually made, as a company. And in making those decisions, I think you have to look forward to Anne's point on what are the future risks, what are the future directions or imperatives that you have from a societal perspective, from an employee perspective, from a customer perspective. I think you have to look at stakeholders broadly. I think if you just look at one stakeholder class, you run the risk of being kind of blindsided when all of a sudden a developing issue within this stakeholder group that you hadn't actually thought about comes in and actually impacts you and impacts your business in a pretty major way. Maybe I'll leave it at that, but it's a great topic, a great question.
Well, thank you, John. And it's of course very, very interesting to say that the company has to reflect the values of the society, and especially in the sphere of social issues. So, and you are also a governance expert, and you have thought about directors' duties and so forth. What are the issues in governance that we should take into account if we talk about ESG risks? Now we're talking a lot about E. John talked about quite a bit about S, but what about G, governance? Is that also important? Or that's okay? Well, that's all have we been talking about governance for the past 50 years. Enough of that.
There's never enough, is there? So in terms of one of the things that's happening, obviously, as this trend continues, is the need and the demand for more disclosure, transparency, accountability, right? And as investors and regulators and other stakeholders, I like John's point a lot about you have to keep your eye on all the different stakeholders and their different needs and requirements. But the demands for greater disclosure mean that companies are needing to report on what their ESG strategy is, how they're measuring success, and then being able to verify whether or not they're achieving their objectives, for example. So this demand for disclosure and greater levels of disclosure, I mean, some of these reports are very, very lengthy, as I'm sure you all know. The more you say, the more opportunity there is for misstatements, for misrepresentation, for overstating your successes, et cetera. So that, I think, is a significant risk that companies need to pay attention to, especially for directors and officers. I mean, that would be a serious concern. Related to that is that this whole area invites companies to spend time thinking about and developing corporate policies that are meaningful in ED&I, for example, and generally around safety, et cetera, corruption, all these sorts of things. So lots of corporate policies. But once you have a policy, it also means you have to abide by that policy. So these areas are areas where if companies aren't careful and they are not really being authentic in terms of what their intentions are, and going back to John's point, if they're not tied to what their overall purpose and their values are, it's going to be more and more likely that there's going to be a disconnect between what is said and what is done. And so I see that as a real risk for some companies. And to a large extent, I think it comes back to sincere commitment on the part of senior leadership that this matters. Because if it actually ends up being embedded in the DNA of the company, then you don't necessarily have this risk. If it's something that you're doing just because the company thinks that it has to, or to tick a box, then I think this risk of your disclosures not matching your company behavior becomes a real challenge.
Those are very fundamental good points. Let me now go a little bit of the Q&A, because there's a lot of questions. So now let me start picking up something that let our audience have a voice. And a little bit tied to the conversations being having is that there's one great question is that what do you see as the biggest single challenge in front of organizations in establishing effective ESG policies that actually benefit the corporation? John, maybe go to you first.
It's a great question, and one of them is maybe I'll touch on one that's internal, and the other one that is external. And the one that is internal, at least from my perspective, is, and Anne alluded to it, you can't underestimate the cultural change that's required in an organization to get people more focused on and take seriously all of the various pathways that a company is focused on from an ESG perspective. And maybe we'll just use the term sustainability. from a forward-looking perspective, it is it's pretty dramatic. And I can tell you in our company, we spend a lot of time working on behaviors. We spend a lot of time trying to understand what the predispositions are of our employees, right through to business units, to see if they sort of align with the kind of behaviors that are critical for the company to go forward and actually succeed in the evolving, competitive landscape that we see in the balance of this decade and the decades to come. It's a lot of work. So unless people take it seriously and show leadership and actually show up prepared to talk in a meaningful way about the challenges and the risks that are there and have thought about it, they don't just show up in a meeting, having given it 5 minutes of thought, but have been thoughtful and deliberate and bring data, bring analysis, are thoughtful in the remedial plans that are being developed to address the issues in question. I think you're going to fail. You actually need to make sure that the notion of near-term, medium-term, long-term risk assessment, what the impacts are in the company, what the company's responses are towards those holistically, and what it means for the targets that you're setting, and not just financial targets, but all of the targets that you have, both from a performance and from a sustainability perspective. And for a company like ours, it includes safety as being a key component. I think it begins with sort of the internal culture of the company. So that would be one. The second thing I mentioned externally, the thing candidly that we are struggling with in terms of trying to map a pathway or pathways forward is just uncertainty around government policy, frankly, and the regulatory environment that we find ourselves in. Everybody wants clarity, but you can imagine the challenge associated with making an investment that has a 20-year payback, for example, and requires a certain landscape in order for it to make sense. And the turbulence, and this isn't a criticism, it's just an observation. I get that it's challenging to actually, in a rapidly changing environment in which sort of global issues are continually evolving, to kind of land a policy. And it's exacerbated by sort of the checks and balances and kind of the federal system we have in Canada, where, you have at times conflicting approaches and messaging coming from different levels of government, from the federal government right down to the local, municipal level. It is a real, challenge. And when I look at sort of Canada's, climate change objectives, for example, that we have going to 2030, it's hard to see how we're going to get there. When there is policy uncertainty, just getting something permitted might take years to be able to get, let alone, doing the investment in the building of it. And then maybe the last thing, we can talk more about it, is the impact it has on the communities. I mean, the transition unfortunately has winners, but it also has losers and people that are negatively impacted by the kinds of changes that are taking place. And I'm not sure that there's been enough of a dialogue around that, candidly, in terms of, the realistic pathways and what it actually means to go from point A to point B.
Thank you, John. It's just, we have always thinking about the ESG almost like the technological problem, but there's also social problems like just transition. Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about this, thinking about social issues, thinking about policy uncertainty, transition risk, regulatory risks. How can companies then come up with a successful ESG strategies that actually help the organizations to navigate going forward? I mean, if you just having a run-of-the-mill, let's tick some boxes, that's probably not going to help you that much going forward. How do companies can actually manage these risks when we have so many uncertainties, so many risks coming from the policy side and also from the market side?
Right. So I'm going to say it again, which is the importance of starting with purpose, vision, and values, because otherwise, again, there's a higher risk of a disconnect between what you're attempting to do and what the company really is trying to achieve. So that's number one. The second one is start where you are, and for companies to recognize that they're already doing some of this. So get a clear idea of what you're already doing, what you're already measuring, and do a gap analysis, and then focus on the material risks. Again, in terms of the ESG, obviously energy companies have to pay a lot of attention to the E, and they have, but not necessarily all different aspects of E. So really getting focused on which of those are material, because as the company develops this ESG strategy over time, right, the efficient allocation of the resources means you want to start with the most material risks. And then the third point I would say is, and companies learned this too when they were developing enterprise risk management, which is it's got to be integrated into what the company's doing. So leverage whatever initiatives the company is already doing, and the risk management is the perfect place to start, and integrate that into what the company is doing, and then build on that, rather than in some ways separating it. Because for a lot of companies, the corporate social responsibility people were over here, the risk management people were over here, and they weren't necessarily talking to each other. So those really need to be integrated better in order for there to be a meaningful conversation, and really the ability to look farther down the road, as John was saying, in order to see what some of these risks are that really are not evident today.
Thank you, Anna. So there's so many great questions coming in Q&A. So let me just touch on some one questions that a lot of people have been discussing. So that they're talking about the current energy situation in Europe, where natural gas prices have been increasing tremendously, and also here in North America, we can see oil prices increasing, and price at the pump increasing a lot. And then some people are wondering, have we paid too much attention to future, too much attention to the ESG? How about, I mean, we have now, looks like that we have, right, all the oil and gas prices are going up. There are tremendous opportunities in the conventional so-called old economy. Have we kind of overplayed our hand in ESG issues? John, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I don't. It's a great question. We could probably spend hours just talking about this one by itself. I don't think, I don't think that you can overplay the shift to ESG. I think, maybe I'll give an example, and then I can talk about the current situation, at least from our company's perspective, very quickly. Look, the last time I've managed, during COVID-19, which is another example. I mean, we didn't have a pandemic as one of the risks that we were assessing in terms of, trying to respond to as a company, but we do now, I can tell you. But I've only been out of the country twice since COVID-19, or once since COVID-19 took place. The time immediately before the pandemic was sort of front and face was actually at an investor conference in London, which was in January of 2020. It feels like a long time ago now. And I can tell you that, being in meetings with investors that, frankly, understood that there will be hiccups in the path to where they're trying to get to, but we're absolutely saying we just don't have capital for this type of business, that type of business, or this type of business. And in fact, we're looking at divesting from, your type of business to move our allocation of investments into different kinds of business was pretty stark. And it was something that had been building over time. And, and frankly, I found that a lot of times, and look, I was there in my TransAlta renewables hat, so we were pretty pristine, right? We were Canada's leading wind company. Although we had natural gas fired generation, I found myself sort of defending Alberta a lot in those meetings, and it was pretty remarkable when you would say, look, we care profoundly about our environment. Our emissions per output have continued to decline. They weren't having any of it. I mean, what they were basically saying in return is that's all fine and good. We don't care. The fact is your aggregate emissions are up 30%. And I don't want to hear about you guys being 1 or 1.5% of the total emissions in the world. We're just not going to provide you with capital. And for me, kind of that mindset, kind of that European mindset is sort of an early sense, an early window into where we're going a bit. I think North America lags it a bit, although I have to say it's accelerating a lot here as well. So I think it is a profound shift, setting aside the actual challenges that are being posed by climate change and our responsibility to our responsibility to ensure that we, the world isn't being impacted. Having said all of that, the transition is really, really challenging. And the example that I was using then was, and it was a January, and it was minus 30 in Calgary. And the point that I made to everybody that I was meeting with was, look, we've got hundreds of megawatts of wind in Alberta today. There's only 4 that are being generated. The province needs 10,500 today, 4. And even though we're the biggest player, none of them are ours. So that's a bit disturbing. And by the way, because when it's cold, there's no wind. It just doesn't blow. And, we talked about solar as well. And I said, in the depths of winter, when you've got very few hours of daylight and the panels might be covered in snow, it's not great as a resource. So in the absence of, natural gas or storage, and we're not there on storage, you're into a life and death, situation in terms of what can happen to people. And we saw that play out in Texas, earlier. So it's those, kinds of discussions that we haven't had. They haven't been great discussions in terms of sort of buttressing the importance of making sure that you have a reliable and efficient system. And, some of, at least from my own perspective, some of the best work on that I've seen is actually being done in Australia. We have a significant business in Australia, so we sort of keep abreast of what's going on there. And they're very, very focused on, how do we make the transition? So for example, they're saying, absolutely, we're shutting down our coal, and it's going to happen in an accelerated way. We're going to need renewables. But we want the renewables built in these 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 zones where there's transmission, because we want to make sure that the system is actually affordable for industry and consumers as opposed to overbuilding it. The second element they kind of say is we also need to backstop the system. So if that means pump hydro, storage, gas generation, whatever it is, we're going to make sure that it's there for when we need it. And we need to do that in a responsible way. And frankly, if it isn't going to be there, or the market signals aren't strong enough for it to be there, the government will step in to make sure that it's there. Because I think speaking again just for my own, one of the myths a little bit about the energy transition is that it'll miraculously happen easily just with the market, as opposed to requiring a thoughtful kind of approach to actually get from point A to point B. I think it is going to require everybody working together to make sure that we do it in a thoughtful way, and there aren't a whole bunch of unintended circumstances. So look, as a company, we've got gas-fired generation, we have coal-fired generation, we have hydro, we have wind, we have solar, we have storage. For sure, the world is decarbonizing, but that's not going to happen overnight. That's a long-term view, and at least from our own perspective, there are a lot of real challenges with taking some of that important carbon-based generation out of the fuel mix today, and frankly, for the foreseeable period of time. And I think we should have an honest conversation around that. So
it's absolutely true that energy transition cannot happen overnight. It is truly a wicked problem. It's a systemic change, and it's going to take. I mean, it's one of the hardest problems humanity has ever dealt with. And then so that also applies not only to climate change, but also some other ESG issues, social issues, inequities, inclusion, and often we talk about ESG. So ESG policies as giving corporations competitive advantage. So corporations are doing something great on ESG front, but in order to really have an impact on society, it's not enough that some great company like TransAlta is having fantastic ESG programs. most companies should have at least start thinking about these issues. So how do we kind of coordinate or combine the competitive urge to separate from the pack and also working together with other firms? Is there any way of getting around that problem?
There's a question I haven't thought too much about, but what comes to mind is.
Sorry, I blame the Q&A, so that's.
That's all right. You know, I'll give it a shot. One thing that comes to mind is just the importance too of companies benchmarking against others in the industry, and paying attention to what others are doing, because I think this helps everybody up their game. And in reality, right now, in terms of both, you know, the ratings that are done, credit ratings and otherwise, that companies need to be paying attention to what their peers are doing. And I believe there's also an opportunity to look beyond your own industry sector to see what best practices are in other places as well. So I think that's one important thing. There are also clearly industry associations also offer the opportunity to share those type of best practices, and I think there's an opportunity for doing that. This is somewhat related, which I think the talent management risk moving forward, many companies have this as a top 10 risk on their risk registers or on their risk maps. And talent management is going to be, I think, more and more difficult. And this is where companies have an opportunity to set themselves apart and create a competitive advantage in terms of being better, especially probably on the S front, in terms of health and safety, in terms of wellness, in terms of training, in terms of opportunity, in terms of diversity and inclusion. And so I see that as one really important area for companies to pay attention to, because from a risk standpoint, managing that risk of talent management moving forward is just so key to so many companies.
This was an excellent point, Sam. John, you mentioned earlier, I mean, the justice aspects of energy transition. So how do you deal with them inside TransAlta when you're moving away first from coal, now downplaying gas and into renewables? How do you take care of those employees that have spent their whole life, whole career in coal or gas, and now say, okay, we will be going to this solar and wind, and how there could be some equity issues there, right?
It is a massive challenge, and I would say probably the one thing that keeps me up most at night, along with at least our leadership team. And we've been going through the transition for a while. I'll give you a bit of a sense of it, Yrjo, just so that you have a kind of tangible sense. So our company is growing, but the number of employees that we have is actually shrinking. And probably the most, a couple of examples would be, we had 2 coal-fired plants in Washington State. One was required from a regulatory perspective to be shut down at the end of last year, which we did, and that resulted in a third of the workforce there no longer being employed by our company. We're shutting our coal mine in Alberta at the end of this year, in December of this year. That mine, which was at one point the largest open pit coal mine in the country, used to employ 750 people west of Edmonton. By kind of early January, that'll be down to 50. So you cannot underestimate kind of the societal impacts that it has, in the communities that are most affected. And when people, and this is something we've talked a lot about, people talk about the energy transition, I always remind them, I go, a coal-fired plant, 200 employees, 150 employees. A gas plant, 40 employees. A wind farm, 10. These are apples to apples in terms of size, right? In terms of nameplate size. A solar farm, 2. So there's profound changes from an employment perspective that are taking place. I mean, how do we deal with it? It began, at least for us, by reference, and I think we talked about it earlier, I was going to actually jump into it. People were talking about values, and it's been an issue for us in terms of our the impacts to a number of our employees, but also just the way we've had to deal with the pandemic. You know, a lot of times people pay lip service to values. I have to tell you, it is critical. It has been critical for us in what has been a challenging time period. So when we think of respect, when we think of safety, when we think of integrity, those have been absolutely critical kind of drivers for us in terms of going forward. So it begins through communication. You know, you can hold off the bad news, but I think the quicker you tell people what's happening, when it's going to happen, what it means for them, what it means for the community, what it means for the Indigenous communities that we support in the area, what it means for the county in terms of its tax base going forward, absolutely critical. And then it's everything from making sure people are compensated properly to, in our case, hosting job fairs, to even getting to a place where, you know, we were working with some of the you know, post-secondary institutions to see if you know, there was any, just experientially, if people had you know, a ticket, for example, that they had earned but actually hadn't secured, is there something that we could do to expedite the process so they could set themselves up to be able to transition from, you know, where they were working to perhaps a new place where they could work, which in many cases for a bunch of people means that they might need to relocate or at least travel to be able to work, you know, from some of the more remote communities in Centralia and Washington State. As we phase out our coal-fired generation, it's a more challenged economically. You know, people think of Washington State, they think of Seattle. A lot of the state isn't like Seattle, and people have a challenged environment. So we've set aside, you know, tens of millions of dollars to create coal transition, to help kind of bring new business parks, new jobs, new opportunities into the region, to kind of try to buttress, you know, that the employment and the opportunity set in those communities. It is a big deal. Governments help at all levels as well going forward. We were pretty proud that when, you know, some of the government organizations, when they sort of stepped in to see how they could help, they found that we were basically doing everything and more in terms of managing through the transition. But it is tough, and it is not, you know, it impacts the men and women that are out there in ways that are profound and are a bit hidden, frankly. And, you know, just philosophically, sometimes government takes the view, well, we've got, you know, systems in place that can support individuals, whether it's, you know, welfare, employment insurance, training programs, all those kinds of things that can help do it. My sense of it is that's fine. And in many cases, we have a bit of an older working population, some of which would fortunately be looking to retire at that time. And I'm going on because it's a big deal for us. But, you know, people would rather just work than get the support. I know the support is there to act as a bridge, but I think for most people, it's just a bridge, and they really do want to get productive and moving forward. So the dislocations are pretty profound. And I think when we think of the kind of transition that we're talking about doing in the country, and I'm just in the electricity business, I think of it in the oil and gas sector as well. It's not an insignificant change. It is something that will need to be thought through thoughtfully, and you know, the social implications are pretty dramatic, and I think we should be pretty clear-eyed about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because often these days we try to emphasize, although energy transition is going to be great opportunity, the best business opportunity for a generation. But at the same time, you have to realize that it's going to be winners and losers. And we have to be honest about that, prepare people for that, and have to be sure that we treat people fairly and equitably, and take care of all the people. So nobody should be left behind, and that's a huge societal challenge. And I'm not blaming people at all feeling anxious. I'm absolutely. I would, if I was working in a gas plant, and I would definitely feel anxious about it. What is there for me in 5 or 10 years? But this is a tremendous challenge.
I think, Yrjo, I mean, just an example, I think, and you would know better than me. I mean, I think that I think I read somewhere that, just as an example, the petroleum engineering program at the University of Calgary, I think, is going to be phased out. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic early warning from my perspective, rightly or wrongly, like I'm not just observing it as you know, our younger people kind of looking out into the future and making those kind of decisions, and it's challenging for sure.
Brief closing statements, and then we go over to Jerry before he gets too anxious about energy transformation. So Anne, so since you're also teaching in the directors program, what do you see as the role of board of directors as opposed to the executive officers in a corporation like John? What do you see the board of directors' role in ESG policies?
Yeah, I think it begins with setting the strategy of the company, and then again, sort of relating that to what the company is going to deliver on from an ESG standpoint. And really, fundamentally, one of the most important duties of a board is to pay attention to what the material risks are of the organization. And so there's a need for directors to be eyes wide open in terms of what these risks are, and again, being very focused on their particular company's circumstance and where the industry is heading. So I think that's just one of the most important things that the board needs to do.
Thank you, and John, final question to you. This is okay. I got to. So we have COP26 starting soon, and in Glasgow, and everybody's talking about 2030 goals and 2050 goals. In your opinion, what are the chances that Canada, as a nation, will fulfill its 2030 goals and 2050 goals? So this is a little unfair question, but I have to ask this.
So look, maybe I'll try to answer it this way. You know, our country emits just under 800 megatons of CO2 a year. I'm just going to focus on CO2. I think it's 770 and change, something like that. Alberta's about 300 of that. You know, in terms of just you know, the single jurisdiction. From, you know, I think it is over the course of the last 15 years, we've reduced our emissions by 1%. And we've got less than 8.5 years left to get those targets, which have gone from you know, they've increased, right, to 40-45% under the current government. We talked about how long it takes to get permitting done. You know, we talk a lot about some of the technological solutions, including CCS and hydrogen and those kinds of things. We're concerned a lot of that, and there is government funding, and the government's looking at putting policies in place. Those things have not, how can I put it? There's a lot of work left to do to land kind of technological solutions to get us from where we are today to where we need to be. And it won't be easy to do it. And it certainly won't, at least in my view, be easy to do it in 8.5 years, let alone there being sort of an increasing emphasis on the standards. I think this is a long-term play that we need to do, and we need to do it responsibly. We need to do it in a way that takes care of our people, does it in a cost-effective way. So I think what I'm telling you is it is based on the current trajectory that we're on. We need to do a lot more if we have any hope of getting there. And I think the other thing I think that we need to do is actually have an honest conversation about Canadians, what it means to their day-to-day lives. It does mean big changes in the way people live their lives on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think that conversation's been had with people. I think when you tell people, you know, are you willing to spend $50 to clean up the environment? They say, yeah. But if the answer is hundreds actually of dollars a year, if it means you can't drive a big SUV, if it means that your heating in the house has to fall, if it means, you know, we can't keep building big houses. I mean, I'm just, you know, throwing, you know, if it means public transit, if it means our cities have to densify. I mean, those are the kinds of discussions we need to have. I'm not sure that we've had those kinds of discussions with folks in this country. I don't know that other countries are any better in terms of getting us from where we need to go. I just don't think we're there.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, John. You've been fabulous panelists. And thank you, the audience, for joining us. It's been a very, very good session.